Hello, and welcome everyone to our Faith and Public Life Roundtable series. As people are joining coming in from the waiting room, I just want to say welcome. And this is a roundtable series sponsored by Faith and Public Life with a focus on the Ohio State Supreme Court. And there is a two-part series beginning with today's focus on how the state Supreme Court impacts our voting rights. The second roundtable will be on October 24th. You'll hear more about that later, but that will focus on the state Supreme Court and its impact on reproductive health care. Both roundtables are timely as we are all beginning to pay attention and cast our ballots. That's a pretty exciting time. These roundtables are designed as C3 nonpartisan and are packed with information so our fellow Ohioans can make informed decisions about the votes you cast, especially for often overlooked judicial races. I'm guilty of that in the past, but not anymore. The bottom of the ballot is just as important to our everyday lives as the top of the ticket. At Faith and Public Life, our mission is to advance the moral imperative for a just, inclusive, and equitable country so that everyone can live into their full humanity. We work with faith and community leaders to take transformative action. With faith-forward strategy, we help build cultures of belonging and leverage the collective power of our multi-faith and multi-racial coalition to lead us closer to realizing a healthy and equitable democracy. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Common Good and Red Wine and Blue. Both organizations center the importance of our full participation to make democracy as healthy and fair as possible for all Ohioans. So thank you very much. Our hope is also that you'll leave here today with increased understanding of the state Supreme Court's decisions, the impacts on our lives, a few stories of real impact, and to know the importance of your vote, including the judicial positions for the state Supreme Court. Basically, your vote matters, so plan wisely, and yes, vote. I'm Reverend Dr. Marion Stewart. I'm the Ohio organizer for Faith and Public Life. And if you've ever wondered why we're talking about the state Supreme Court, it does have an impact on your life. For example, a recent court decision ruled that chicken wings advertised as boneless can indeed have bones. I mean, go figure, right? This might seem silly, but that decision actually impacts our rights to have a trial by jury. So what they decide really has impact. Other decisions affect everything from Ohioans' access for comprehensive reproductive health care. Yes, we passed that issue 1, but access is a whole different issue, and the courts are deciding that now. They also impact issues about the ballot box and access to ballot box. How we vote determines who makes the decisions. So let's unpack with a few Ohio basics. So let's look at the org chart for the state. If we could do that, Mia. Mia's our tech guru. I appreciate that. What we have here is a state diagram of all the offices, mostly elected. You see the ones in orange. Those are the ones we're talking about today or hear a lot about in the news. So-and-so decided this, or it went there, or whatever. All this impacts our access to the ballot box and our ability to actually vote and who we vote for, how we vote. Everything is kind of tied up into this circle of people. It impacts each branch of our government. You can see that there. And on the middle right, you see Supreme Court. It's quite interesting because before 2020, all Supreme Court races were nonpartisan. But in 2021, our Ohio State Legislature voted that beginning 2022, all general ballot elections had to include party affiliation for Supreme Court justices. So that really makes a difference in who gets elected. So sometimes folks might vote by party and not really read the description or what they stand for, or they like their name or they don't, or they're confused, they leave it blank. It really impacts everything. And that's sort of what we're talking about today is who we vote for and the makeup of the court in general, how that impacts our voting rights. You'll also see where the Attorney General is down here, the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, the lower two there that are orange. They serve 4-year terms. They are voted on the off presidential cycle. So they will be up for re-election in 2026. And the ballot board, you see that off to the right, is made up of a different group of people. The Secretary of State obviously is on the ballot board, but also one each from the Senate, House, and minority leadership, as well as the House majority and minority leadership. So that makes up the ballot board. And if you have any questions, let me know about that. But that's basically how we run things in Ohio. So all this matters. And with that in mind, let me introduce our wonderful panel today. We have amazing people on the panel. I'm going to go in alphabetical order just because they're all so great. First, we have Nazak Hapisa from League of Women Voters of Ohio. She's currently the Policy Affairs Manager at LWV. She holds a Master of Public Administration from John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University. In addition to her professional work, she's long been active in the Noor Islamic Cultural Center and currently serves on the board of the Ohio Isfahan Academy. So welcome, Nazak. Next, we have Kayla Griffin from All Voting is Local. She serves as the State Director for All Voting is Local. She has a background in community organizing, and she advocates for voter rights and election protection as the chair of Norman S. Minor Bar Association Community Engagement Committee. That is a mouthful. And she also serves on the Cleveland branch of the NAACP as a criminal justice and legal redress chair. She holds a Juris Doctorate and a Master's of Public Administration from Cleveland State University and a bachelor's degree from Kent State University. So a true Ohioan right there. We also have Reverend Ben Guess from the ALCU Ohio. He's a civil liberties activist and minister and serves as executive director of the ACLU of Ohio. Ben spent 17 years in executive and senior staff roles with the United Church of Christ. He advocates for racial, social, gender, and economic justice, and he currently serves on the board of the National LGBTQ Task Force in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ben. And we have Jean Perez she's a state program director for Red, Wine, and Blue of Ohio. That's a community of women standing up to extremism in our local communities and across our state. That's a big job. Jean worked in the corporate world, but when the Supreme Court decided Dobbs, she looked at her own experiences and decided to work for issues that matter to all Ohioans. So thank you, Jen. And we have Catherine Terser, who's Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio, a grassroots organization developed to open and accountable government. As a public interest lobbyist, Catherine promotes access to the ballot and open government at the Ohio State House. Catherine serves on just about every board there is. She's on the steering committee for Fair Districts Ohio, Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, and she organizes the Judge the Ads Project and serves on the board of Ohioans Against Extremism. Prior to her tenure at Common Cause Ohio, Catherine led Ohio Citizens Action Money in Politics program. Basically, all things Ohio, go see Catherine. So welcome, Catherine. Now it's time for our discussion. Here's the good part. Are we ready? First question goes to Reverend Ben Guess from ACLU. In the introduction, I gave a brief overview of Ohio government structure, including relevant electoral cycles. Can you tell our audience what type of democracy and voting right issues are decided by the Ohio State Supreme Court, and what is before the court now, if anything?
Yeah, good question. I mean, first of all, I want to just emphasize that that state elections matter. I think we have a proclivity as voters and as citizens sometimes to think that the most important things happen at the top of the ticket at a federal level. Those issues and those office holders are important, but we need to really focus on why it's important in the state, and it's why many of our organizations, the ACLU included, has a state presence in every state, because those issues are so important. Essentially, the Ohio Supreme Court is as important as the United States Supreme Court. It just depends on which issues are coming into which court system. So if you think of the federal court system having district, circuit, and then United States Supreme Court, we have the same thing in Ohio with courts of common pleas in every county, and then the Court of Appeals, and then reaches the Ohio State Supreme Court. So they are the top arbitrator of any issues that are coming before our state courts, many which would begin in common pleas, work their way up until they reach the Ohio Supreme Court. And many of the voting restrictions that we have seen of late are being challenged in the Ohio Supreme Court. One thing in particular, House Bill 458, which changed many of our voting ID laws and restrictions on voter participation, were challenged in different ways in our state court system. One of those challenges that the ACLU legal team led on was a challenge around the access for people with disabilities. This issue we actually won in the courts, and then Frank LaRose, our Secretary of State, issued a directive that, in our view, was punitive towards all voters. That said that if you're returning someone else's ballot, you can't just drop it in a drop box, but you actually have to then go into the BOE. It means you can't do it after hours. It means you have to sign an attestation that you're not doing anything unlawful under threat of a penalty. It just intimidates people from wanting to help people with disabilities or others to return their ballots. So that's the kind of issue that is before our state Supreme Court right now, and they will be the ultimate arbiter of how those rules, not only what the law is, but how those laws are interpreted. And that's a really important point, because so many, it's not just deciding what the law is, but it's how do you interpret that law. So we passed a reproductive freedom amendment. We may win in court on other issues. There may be a change in the redistricting process at the November ballot this year, and how those laws or constitutional amendments are interpreted go a long way in how they are actually read and understood and implemented. So it's also important to note that the Ohio Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in a lot of matters. So while I mentioned the different steps that you're stepping up in the court system, many matters within 90 days of an election go immediately to the Ohio Supreme Court, and they have ultimate say-so on a lot of matters. For example, I mentioned the redistricting measure being led by the Campaign Citizens Not Politicians. The ballot board wrote language which many felt was not fair and accurate as to what the ballot measure actually does. And that question as to whether it should stand or be changed went immediately to the Ohio Supreme Court. So this impacts, not only measures that are already enacted, but will also impact questions of ballot measures that many of us may be working on in the future, like any challenges to those ballot measures that would immediately go to the Ohio Supreme Court. So an incredible amount of power invested in these 7 individuals, and there are 3 important races this election cycle.
Wow, thanks, Ben. That is a lot of power. And thank you to you and the ACLU, as well as other groups, trying to wade through all of that and make everything work on our behalf. So thank you very much. And Catherine, you're up. Since 2021, the Supreme Court candidates have had to declare party affiliation, like I mentioned earlier. In the August 24th edition of the Ohio Capitol Journal, you are quoted, We shouldn't actually be thinking Democrats and Republicans, because at the end of the day, what you want is a referee who's independent and impartial. Can you talk about partisanship and how it impacts judicial decisions? And also, how has this impacted the goal of citizen representation?
So it seems really naive at this point to say, hey, don't think about party labels. But what is really sad is that we moved from thinking about the courts as a fair referee, an arbiter of the truth, and instead are at a point where people are saying, okay, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, and that's enough to figure out whether you should vote for them. And certainly the court became more partisan because more Democrats ended up on the Ohio Supreme Court. And so the state legislature used their power to change the rules. And they didn't change the rules for all judges. They changed the rules for the Ohio Supreme Court and for the appeals court. That means at the local level, the courts still, when you go to vote for them, they don't have a party label because they were they were focused on getting more of their conservative friends elected. And I think we can say that without being partisan, but we do need to call out when they're kind of bad actors and when there are rules that are put in place for our elections that actually make us not create courts that are not as impartial as they could be. Now, I said, it's a little silly to be so naive. It's also important to remember, Maureen O'Connor, who served as the Chief Justice, is somebody who, sided with the voters. And many of us are very aware that she repeatedly, as Chief Justice, sent map making back to the Ohio Redistricting Commission and said, hey, these are partisan gerrymanders repeatedly, so 7 times she was the leader in those decisions. But she also did it in 2011 with Wilson v. Kasich. And so one of the things I think is important is that we should be looking to are these judges that we want? And so you mentioned the decision that I look at as pro-business as opposed to consumer. I myself am more worried about people being able to eat food and the safety of consumers than I am businesses. So I think we can look at that decision, look at who made that decision, and make some judgments about whether we want them to be on the Ohio Supreme Court. We can also say, look at what happened with the ballot board. Though basically that gets challenged, and a majority of the court was perfectly fine with saying that gerrymandering is required by the Ohio Redistricting Commission. Not banned, which is in the amendment, not banned, which was in the summary that was approved by the Attorney General. So we know that our court, our Ohio Supreme Court, has become more partisan. And so we need to be really thoughtful about how do we address that? How do we look to judges that are good? And I think, there are things we can do. We can look at judicial votes count. We can judicialvotescount.org. I have the site with Common Cause Ohio and with the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance that I always try to highlight, which is judgetheads.org, which encourages people to look at the political ads surrounding judges. But also you can find out who actually endorsed the candidates? And you can start to think about, is this who I want? And it makes you think about, what are the decisions that I should be looking at so that I can be thoughtful? There's a little bit of information about the appointment process as well. And so I also love, there's a judgeforyourself.com. Now, this is one that focuses on Cuyahoga County. But I highly encourage you, if you get to that, get to the candidate overview pages, and it includes, different local bar associations and prosecutors and the newspaper. It looks at, how did they rate the candidates? And you have to scroll down a little ways, but you can find the Ohio Supreme Court there, and you can look at what different organizations have said about the candidates for Ohio Supreme Court. So I just urge everyone, don't just pick the D or the R. Think about the role of the courts as referee and be thoughtful and do a little bit of research. And with that, I'll hand it back to you.
That's a lot. Wow. And that's a great lens to look at the courts and how their decisions impact our lives. And I appreciate your framing on that. Thank you. So, Kayla, can you talk about how decisions Ohio State Supreme Court influence our democracy and voting rights, and how that impacts our communities and how they're represented, or how our communities and individual citizens and residents have a voice? And give an example if you can, because I know you're on the ground there.
Absolutely. I think we can kind of echo and highlight some of the things that Reverend Ben has brought forth and that Catherine has brought forth, particularly when we're looking at redistricting and the map making process that we just went through. I remember being in the commission meetings when the commissioners were going across the state, listening to people's testimonies about what makes up their community. I gave testimony about what makes up our community. And, being on the ground, hearing people come out from across the state, really talking about how their communities are vibrant and how they feel like they're not being heard at the state level, and how they feel like their communities are being broken up because of map making and line drawing, and they feel like their vote and their voice is diluted because of how the process goes. And then we leave those commissions, we get the maps, and we see that the maps are still unfair and unjust. And then it goes to the court, and the court still sides. The court sides over and over to say, these maps are unconstitutional, they're unconstitutional. And to see that process play out, I think really helped our voters and people on the ground see just how impactful their voice can be for the Supreme Court of Ohio. It took a turn after the courts changed. And I think a lot of people were very disappointed. I know in my home community, while I'm in Cleveland and situated in Cleveland, in my home community in Youngstown, Ohio, and in the Mahoning Valley, they were still trying to bring levy lawsuits and still trying to push against the maps, because it really felt like the voice and the vote was diluted. And so I think that is a really clear example of how decisions that are made down in Columbus are impacting everyday people. Most folks will never go down to Columbus and sit in the halls of the Supreme Court, but to have our lawmakers come to our communities and listen to us and supposedly take that information back down to Columbus to have the voice of the people heard, and then for it to just be ignored because of who is on the court at a specific time, really does us a disservice. And I think voters are starting to pay attention to that. The other thing that I would just highlight in the last minute is when we think about reproductive rights and any of the rights that we see being challenged at the Supreme Court level when it comes to our reproductive rights. Ohio has did an amazing job turning out the vote last year to support reproductive rights. And there is still cases that are going through the court systems to discuss how a woman's bodily autonomy is going to be governed in this state. And so it is often our judges that are making these decisions. And so it's imperative that we are voting folks in that also has the same interest, and we ask them questions about where their interest lies, and not just voting folks based on a party designation.
That's helpful, but I have a question kind of blending Catherine and Kayla, your answers there. Catherine, you talked about the court ruling against the maps, or supporting or saying the maps were unfair, and go back and redraw them for many times, multiple times. And Kayla, you referred to that in a way, but you also said until there was a change. Was that change when the courts became partisan, or when was there a shift? I am detecting a little bit of here's a before land and here's an after land.
So
Either
I
one
think
of you.
yeah, I was going to say, I think the easy way to think about it is that when Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor left, and she didn't leave because she wanted to, she left because she was aged out. I guess that's what they call it. You know, when you're over 70, you can't run for office again, for Ohio Supreme Court. So she wasn't permitted to run again. And there's a new, Chief Justice. So think of the new Chief Justice as setting the direction of the court. And that means that we have a more partisan court. I also think it's important to think about the fact that when Chief Justice Kennedy, became the leader, she left a vacancy, and her vacancy was filled by Joe Dieters. And Joe Dieters is, a family friend of the governor. He is a prosecutor, was a prosecutor for years. Some of us remember when he was treasurer of the state. But he was a prosecutor in Hamilton County. He had no judicial experience, and he was appointed to the Ohio Supreme Court. I think it's also important, as you think about kind of that appointment process, to be aware that the governor also appointed Joe Dieter's brother, Dennis, to the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. And so as we think about our court right now, we also need to think about that the appointment process, and when not just when we elect someone, but also when an appointment is filled, is that process as open as, and as thoughtful as it should be? And what are the kinds of things, that we could be thinking about to set guardrails? Because what we don't want is cronyism. We don't want to have a judge end up in place simply because he or she knows the right people.
That was helpful. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Kayla, for your answer too. And now I have a question for Nazak. You ready? Last July, the League of Women Voters of Ohio and a disabled voter from Berea won a narrow victory in a federal lawsuit. The decision ruled that Ohio's limitations on who can assist an absentee voter ran afoul of federal law with respect to voters with disabilities. Now, Ben referred to that a little bit earlier, but there's also a heated discussion right now over ballot boxes. I see in the news all the time. It's like, it's gone here, it's gone there. And I think nobody really knows what's going to happen right now, but it's over location and security and who has the right to put a ballot in the box. So can you help us understand the role of the courts, especially the state Supreme Court, has in determining access to issues such as ballot boxes?
Thank you, Marion. So as you mentioned, the case that you were referencing was presided over by a federal judge, but nonetheless, the role of the courts, whether it be federal courts or the Ohio Supreme Court, is crucial in shaping access to voting, including around issues related to drop boxes. Their responsibility, especially I'm speaking about the Ohio Supreme Court, is to uphold the law and to ensure that administrative rules comply with the law and that any laws that are passed are constitutional. So it was argued in this lawsuit that you're referencing that Ohio's voter laws violated the Voting Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which are federal laws, and that's why it was presided over by a federal judge. In this case, the League of Women Voters, along with a disabled voter who was also party to the case, secured a narrow but important victory. The court ensured that Ohio's absentee voting laws didn't violate federal protections, specifically the Voting Rights Act in this case. And the reason that we say this ruling was narrow and targeted was because it just asked that the state law change very slightly to be in compliance with federal law, because that takes precedence. Previously, people could only have a close family member from an enumerated list of family members help them with their absentee ballot, and that option just isn't available to everybody. Some people don't have close family members to help them, or don't necessarily choose that person, and the Voting Rights Act says that you should be able to choose whoever you want to help you with your ballot. So following a federal judge's partial invalidation of the House Bill 458, Secretary of State LaRose responded by implementing additional restrictions on absentee ballot drop boxes. His directive limited the individuals authorized to deposit absentee ballots and permitted only voters themselves to utilize drop boxes for their ballot. So this decision actually made it, in some instances, more challenging for others to assist voters in certain situations, because they now have to park their car, get out at the Board of Elections, stand in line, potentially making it more difficult for everyone to to be at the Board of Elections. And just to kind of really help everyone visualize this, I'd like to use one of our own members as an example of this. So we have two people who are roommates, and the person who, our member, is a helper for her roommate, who a while ago had a stroke, and she has to be in a wheelchair. She doesn't speak well. She has many disabilities, okay? But the roommate herself is 82 years old. Like, it is not easy for her to get her roommate to, and she is the chosen helper. Like, the person who had a stroke wants the roommate to help her with her ballot. But it is very difficult for an 82-year-old to help a disabled person. She has disabilities of her own, right? And so it's an unreasonable request to say that she can't use the drop box to drop off the ballot of a person who is elderly and disabled. So this lawsuit forced LaRose to slightly expand the pool of individuals who could assist voters. But again, he introduced these new barriers, which included a requirement for helpers to go inside to the Board of Elections, sign an attestation, and that can only happen during operating hours. So most recently, then, the Ohio Democratic Party and two affected voters filed a lawsuit against this latest directive. And that case is now going before the Ohio Supreme Court, arguing that LaRose's order violates state law and the state constitution, in addition to federal protections. So this case, which is going to be expedited and we hope will be decided before the start of early voting, makes it so that the Ohio Supreme Court has the final say. After this has been back and forth, and everybody's talking about it, realistically, now when we look at this, it's actually these people who sit on the court that will have the final say on the use of drop boxes. So very impactful, even in just this one small case.
That's huge impact. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for the example too. That makes it real. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Question to all panelists, whoever wants to pick this one up. While the Constitution declares separation of church and state, I also want to acknowledge that we each come to the table with a set of values and morals, often rooted in generational wisdom and faith traditions. So can you tell me how your faith informs not just who you are, but also how you participate in this grand experiment of democracy? Also, how does your faith influence not just your right to vote, but also the voting rights of others? Now, that's a loaded question, several questions, but if anybody wants to tackle that, go for it. The stage is yours.
Well, I just spoke, Marion, but I'd love to jump in if I could.
Sure.
We always have discussions about how our faith is so important to us in this work. This work for me, and I know for a lot of people, is soul work. And if it were not, we wouldn't do what we're doing. And there are personally many aspects of my faith that have kept me motivated and energized and intentional in this work. For me, repeatedly in our holy text, the Quran, God tells us that we all have an obligation to enjoin what is good and to forbid what is evil. That's called advocacy. That's what we do, right? Our prophetic guidance really in so many traditions teach us that people of faith are people of service. In my own tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is known to have said, the best people are people who benefit others. Muslims believe that our purpose on this earth is to worship, and that's why we were created. But I think the missing link for a lot of people is that people don't understand what worship is. People think that worship is between them and their Lord, and they think of ritual worship. But there's a lot of evidence I could point to, at least in the Muslim tradition, that exemplifies that while ritual worship and prayer connects us to God in a more direct way, our purpose is actually to be representatives of God's mercy and justice in everything that we do.
Thank you. Thank you. I also know there are a couple ordained ministers on this panel, and if anybody wants to speak to that question before we go to the next one.
Yeah, I grew up as a young person really interested in politics and public policy and public life. I actually thought I would always go to law school somewhere. And my freshman year of college, someone gave me a little book by a theologian named Leonardo Boff, who was called Introducing Liberation Theology. And I began to understand, the interpretation of text and who is doing that interpretation matters. And those sort of questions is what drove me to go get 2 theological degrees and actually be ordained. I found the United Church of Christ. UCC was not the tradition of my upbringing as a child, but I found the UCC because it is a faith tradition that really emphasizes public service and public engagement as being really central to our faith. One of the things we say in the UCC is to believe is to care, and to care is to do. And a part of that doing is public advocacy on behalf of marginalized communities. And that's so much of what we're doing in a voting rights conversation, is making sure everyone is involved and empowered and has access to the democratic processes. And the UCC also has a longstanding public engagement program called Our Faith, Our Vote, in which we perennially are educating congregations and faith leaders as to why we should be helping educate people within our pews, at our fellowship hours, at our worship services, as a way to help them be better informed voters to make life and democracy work better for everyone.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yes, I know there are a lot of theologies that encourage us to be involved, to be engaged, and that we are responsible for not just ourselves, but also the public good and how we see that. And in this country, that's democracy. So thank you very much. And do you have questions for each other real quick before I get to Jen? I think this panel is so well informed, but I think your examples and what you've said is very important. So thank you to everybody. But I want to close out this time with a question directly to Jen, who's been politely waiting there. And we've done a lot of discussion about voting rights, but the League of Women Voters is also running social media ads declaring if you don't use your voice, someone else will use it, will use your silence. So in 2020, more than 1 million Ohio voters left 2 state Supreme Court races blank. And I want Jen to lead us off, if you will, to talk about the importance not just of voting, but informed voting, especially for judges, before I ask you a follow-up question on a different topic. Jen, can I put you on the spot for that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that statistic that you listed there tells the whole story, right? When we don't vote all the way up and down our ballot, then we're not using our voice, right? Our vote is our voice. It's our opportunity to weigh in on the political process and who's representing us in our state. So, I think forums like this are a great opportunity to learn about judicial races and other races that will be on our ballot. But absolutely, I think all of us here on this panel fully support and work very hard to educate Ohio voters so that they can feel fully informed to be able to vote all the way down ballot.
Yeah, Jen, I feel like I've heard it referred to right now in the election season that you've got this party, that party, and the couch, if you will, people, the stay home people.
Yeah.
But if we look at our ballots and we vote top of the ticket or the more popular, if you will, the ones we see more in advertising, TV, social media stuff, if we vote on those, but then don't vote down ballot and pay attention to that, that's also like just sitting it out.
Right. And
But
if
we also-
anything,
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt you, some of those down ballot races are ones that are going to impact our day-to-day lives most. Those local elections,
Exactly.
your county auditor, your sheriff, like those are really important elections. And there are tools to help you look at your ballot in advance so that you know what you're going to be looking at if you're voting in person. Obviously, we also have in Ohio, you can do mail-in absentee voting. I think a lot of people like that because then they actually have their ballot. They can be doing some research on their computer from their couch while they're voting. But yeah, all of that is super important to take the time to understand what's going to be on my ballot when I go to vote.
I want to jump in with just a practical suggestion that, right now we should all be going either to vote.org or to our local BOEs and making sure that we are registered, that we haven't been, for some reason purged from the voting rolls, and we can make sure that we're registered by next Monday. But also when you're at your local BOE and they say that you're registered, they'll tell you which precinct and ward that you're in, and you'll be able to actually print your ballot and have that before you and actually mark each race and study those races. So you're going in as already have made up your mind as to how you're going to vote on various issues. A lot of us, may take the information that people are handing out as we're coming in, or we may take an endorsement list from an organization that we're part of or from our political party, and we may look at that. And then when we get down, we realize, oh, this is a nonpartisan race. So I don't know how to vote there. Or this issue, there was no endorsement by my local newspaper. So people are like, I don't know how to vote there. If we would all take the opportunity to print out those ballots, and I think that's one way faith communities, if you could actually set up a laptop connected to a printer and you could help people actually do it, print out their ballot, they could have it right there in front of them and they can start marking and preparing how they're going to vote, either
That's
early
awesome.
or either early or on election day.
That's awesome. And Ben, I'm going to ask one more question of Jen first, but then Kayla's going to address some of that at the very end too and give us some tips. But Jen, can you give us a teaser of something coming up? We've got another roundtable coming up on the 24th, and I know that our Ohio State Supreme Court hugely impacts the implementation and access to reproductive health care. And even though we passed, like we said earlier, issue 1 last year, even though you have the right to something, you also have to have access to it. And that's the state Supreme Court. And can you give us a little teaser about how the court impacts and why we should pay attention to this?
Yeah. I think, we know in Ohio that 57% of voters last year made their voices heard and said that in Ohio, we support the right to reproductive freedom. And so what has happened since then is there are still laws on the books that would need to be challenged individually and could end up in front of our Supreme Court. So I forget who it was earlier that talked about how our Supreme Court interprets the laws. And so they are going to be the ones who are interpreting how these laws may be in conflict with issue 1 that we passed in 2023. So when we think about the fight for reproductive rights in Ohio, last year was a huge milestone and the work is not done, right? And so we all need to make sure that we understand how the Supreme Court, and this is what we're going to be talking about on the 24th, how the Supreme Court will be continuing to impact reproductive rights in our state. So again, going back to doing research, understanding who supports, the right to reproductive freedom that we fought so hard to enshrine in our Constitution last year is going to be a lot of what we're talking about on the 24th.
You're right. Thanks. I'm looking forward to that. And Jen's going to be a part of that conversation. We'll have a whole great panel on that. Make sure you tune in for that. But right now we're going to go off of Ben's lead, everybody's lead, really, how important voting is. And Kayla, take us home with, what do we need to do now?
So, as Reverend Ben said, if you haven't checked your voter registration, please just double check it. He said it, and I was like, let me just double check mine again while we were on the line. So double check your voter registration. Military and overseas voting has already started. So we are in voting season. This is election season. Voter registration deadline is October 7th. And then early voting starts on October 8th, the very next day. So if you are one of the ones who is like the early bird gets to learn and want to cast a vote in person, you can go to your local board of elections and cast your ballot on October 8th. If you have still not applied for a vote by mail ballot and you want to apply, we ask that you do that immediately. The deadline to do that is October 29th, but we would say don't wait till October 29th. Definitely get that application in. There's also been some nuance about the application. The Secretary of State's office sent everyone who is registered to vote a vote by mail application to their mailing address. But we also know that some folks are just, take it upon themselves to apply. There is a prescribed form on the Secretary of State's website, and it should be on all of our county's websites as well. That is 2023 or above, like 2023, 2024. That's the application that folks have to use. I know a lot of us have old vote by mail ballot applications just sitting around, particularly when we do tabling, but those are no longer available as the prescribed forms. That was one of the changes that came around our elections and democracy that has caused a bit of confusion. So we're trying to, temper that, let folks know that it's the same form, but it has to have the 2023 updated language on the top corner. And then the last day of early voting is November 3rd. It is the Sunday before Election Day. We no longer have Monday early voting before Election Day. So I want to just make sure folks are reminded of that. But that's an excellent opportunity for faith communities, if they worship on a Sunday, to go together and do souls to the polls, as we would call it, on that Sunday before Election Day. And then the polls are open starting at 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. on Election Day, November 5th. So those are some of the dates that we need to keep in mind. Our drop boxes are open, and hopefully we get a ruling from the court before next week for you to return your application. If you want to return your application in person, your drop box is open for the ballot to be returned in person if necessary. And so those are the nuances that we have around Board of Elections. And you can always find information for all of this at the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition's website, or simply voteohio.gov, voteohio.gov.
That's awesome, Kayla. So I want to lift up a couple of things. One is we need to check our registration, because especially if we haven't voted, maybe we skipped an election or something, your name might have been dropped from the voter rolls. And can somebody say how many names got dropped this round? Catherine, you should know this.
And 40,000.
40,000 people, 40,000 Ohioans were dropped from the rolls.
About 140,000.
140,000.
Yes, I guess that's
That's a lot. So if you're listening, watching, whatever now, or the recording that'll come out later, your name might have been dropped. So you can't vote if you're not registered. So how do we do that again? What's the website?
voteohio.gov, voteohio.gov.
There we go, voteohio.gov. Check your registration. If you're not registered, get it done. The deadline is Tuesday,
It is October 7th.
October 7th. The other thing is, if you go in person to vote, you must show ID. And for those tech wizards, your digital driver's license does not count. It has to be the physical driver's license. So make sure that is correct and your current address and you're at the right place, all those things. So any other voting tips before we close out?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in addition to the great information Kayla was giving with the dates, we actually have 2 weekends of early voting. So those last 2 weekends before the election are great times, especially if you work during the week and the hours aren't conducive for you to go during the week. But I also wanted to just raise this concept that I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and they were asking me like, oh, how many days until the election? And I was like, well, it's, about 33 days until election day, but that's really when the election ends, right? The election has started. We are in it. The absentee ballots are getting mailed. The military and overseas ballots are out. We'd start early voting on October 8th. So if you have friends and family who maybe aren't joining a Zoom call about the Supreme Court and voting, right? We all have so many friends like that who are not tuned in to this work, and they're going to start realizing soon, oh my gosh, there's an election going on. So talk to your friends and family and remind them about everything that you're learning and the importance of these local races, these statewide races, so that they can be informed as well, because we are in it. It is election season. Yes, the election ends on November 5th, but it's not like a goal that we're all working towards. Voting is happening. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you all. That's great. And starting next week, your plan should be go vote. Get it done. Go vote. And inform votes. Study who's running. Vote all the way down ballot and vote with your values. So pay attention who and how you're voting. I want to thank everybody today. Our awesome panelists, just wonderful. Our attendees, participants today. Also the co-sponsors for today, Common Cause and Red, Wine, and Blue. Y'all are great. I'll let you know that this webinar, this roundtable was recorded, and we will send the links to everybody registered, also to our list, so you can share those widely so people can watch it afterwards. It will also be posted on the Faith and Public Life website as soon as we get it downloaded and back up online for you to watch there. You can share it everywhere. Another invitation to our roundtable on October 24th, again, the state Supreme Court, but the focus that time will be on comprehensive reproductive health care and our access to it, how the court impacts that. So another reason to learn and be informed so you can vote. I hope that today through this roundtable, you've increased your understanding of the state Supreme Court and how it fits into our Ohio governance structure and the impact of the court's decisions on our lives. You've heard a few stories of real impact, and that you also know the importance of your vote, including the judicial positions for the state Supreme Court. So I want to thank everybody. And together, I think we can all collectively say that your vote matters. Plan wisely and vote. So thank you very much. And we'll see you on the 24th at our second in the series of Faith and Public Life Roundtables focused on the state Supreme Court and all things that matter to Ohioans. So thank you, everybody, and happy voting. Thank you all.